I want to tell you about a moment when I was really scared. It happened on the afternoon of one of the scariest days in our country's history, September 11th, 2001. Those of you who remember that day probably recall how strange and intensely troubling it was that day. I won't overwhelm you with dozens of pictures showing the horror of what occurred on that day in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. That's necessary. Thousands of Americans could tell you horrible stories from that day. My story is more anecdotal, for sure, happening hundreds of miles away from any real incidents. But at the time it happened, I and everyone around me was genuinely frightened. I was on my way to work as a courier in Clayton, Missouri. I was driving my old Ford Ranger pickup truck, green with a 5-speed transmission and a standard cab. As just about anyone who was alive that day can tell you, I remember exactly where I was when I heard about the first plane crash. I was driving past Forest Park on Clayton Road near Skinker. I remember the highway on my left, the giant Amoco sign in front of me, and the trees on my right. I was headed for Washington University, where I started my day by completing a series of daily pre-scheduled runs. I would transfer letters, packages, and supplies from one university office to another, and from one building to another. So I had frequent access to televisions, and people I saw every day would keep me informed of what was happening. Then, when I got back in my truck to begin regular courier runs, I followed the story on the radio. It was an amazing, amazing day. Of course, everyone was very nervous and on edge that day. Each office I went into, you could see the look of disbelief on people's faces. Every office had a television or radio turned to the news. No one had any idea how many planes were out there or what other methods the terrorists would use that day to carry out their plan. Would other cities be attacked? So it was during the noon hour that I was driving my truck in downtown Clayton. If you are not familiar with Clayton, it is the seat of St. Louis County government with lots of offices, restaurants, and shops. So the area is bustling on any weekday, especially around lunchtime, and especially on a beautiful sunny day like that one. I had just made a right turn from Forsyth onto Central and was passing the county courthouse. There were a couple of parked buses near the entrance to the courthouse. The buses would often park there idling, waiting for passengers. Just as I was passing this particular bus, there was a huge, loud. The force of the blast was powerful enough that I felt it push against the rear panel of my truck on the passenger side. You can imagine what went through my mind. For a second, you have no idea what has happened, and you're not sure what you're going to see when you turn to look. My most vivid memory of that incident was turning around expecting the worst and seeing the stunned faces of dozens of pedestrians who had turned to look at the source of the noise just like I had. That picture is ingrained in my mind forever. At least 100 people staring my direction with these stunned and shocked looks on their faces. As it turned out, it was just the bus backfiring. Even though my mind was telling me everything was going to be all right, I still had to pull over and stop for several minutes. I radioed in and told my dispatcher I would pick up the next run, but then I needed to stop by the office for a few minutes. I just needed a break, I think, or maybe confirmation that no incidents had been reported in Clayton. The following days were strange as well. No planes were in the skies for several days. Middle Eastern looking people were given the evil eye for weeks, if not months, after that day. That's sad, I know, but true. We didn't know what to think. We didn't know what to do or how to act. Every time I drove past the courthouse, I would get this creepy feeling. Talking with other people did help. I've always liked to recount this story when the anniversary of 9/11 comes around. The bottom line is it was a rough day. And for me and many people in Clayton that afternoon, for at least a moment, it was all a little too real. Because for 1 second there, for one instant, we all knew what it felt like to be terrorized.